Hey everyone, welcome to week 8 of Mobile Media and Games. I'm Marcus Carter, I'm the course coordinator, and I'm going to be also leading this part of the course on video games. So in this lecture I'm going to be doing a bit of an introduction to video games, and I'm also going to be overviewing some of the course content and telling you a little bit about the assessment that you're going to be having to do for your final assignment. So in the first part, an introduction to game studies and studying video games. Who am I? So games is my main area of interest. You'll have seen in the last 2 weeks that I'm really interested at the moment in virtual reality and augmented reality, but I did my PhD on a video game called EVE Online, which is a small sci-fi, massively multiplayer online roleplay game like World of Warcraft, but with spaceships, and it's from Iceland, and it's notoriously hard and difficult, and I studied the players who would steal from each other. I was really interested in this type of odd experience as something appealing and fun. In the same vein, I studied a game called DayZ, a zombie survival game in which players would often be racked with guilt when they killed another player in the game. Survivor, which of course features betrayal and people getting very upset and angry about that. But I've also studied lighter games like Candy Crush Saga. A few years ago, I developed the digital games for the orangutans at Melbourne Zoo, which has led to a more recent project that I'm involved in, where I'm filming inside animal enclosures with stereoscopic 180 and 360 degree cameras to design experiences for guests at zoos that leverage the kind of intimacy and close sense of personal presence that people have when you have that intimate encounter with an animal at the zoo. So that's kind of my interests in games. But why study games at all? Why is it that I have a job at the University of Sydney, the best university in Australia, studying video games? And the thing I want to say is studying leisure is important, right? Literature studies has its own department. It doesn't quite have its own building, but it's close to. And books are a form of leisure and storytelling. They're an integral part of our culture. Film studies emerged in the 1930s in response to the enormous cultural and social and economic impact that the film industry was having on society. In similarity, game studies as an academic field really emerged in the late 1990s as its own standalone discipline that sought to similarly understand the appeal, the nature, and the cultural impact of video games as this emerging and dominant economic and cultural force. The important thing to remember when we're talking about studying video games is we're not just doing Call of Duty studies. Just as there are many different types of film, you've got your superhero films, but you've also got French neo-noir and Bollywood films, and you've got indie and an enormous number of subgenres. We have the same for games. We've got AAA, which is a term used in games to refer to really, really big budget video games, often costing upwards of $200 to $300 million to develop. But we've also got indie games, independent games, games that might be made by one, two, or a small team of developers, independent from big publishers and big known brands. And then there are increasingly other genres of punk, alt, different games that seek to kind of critique and challenge maybe some of our ideas about what a game should look like or is. But beyond that too, we've also got mobile games, the games that you play on your phone, just as legitimate and a topic to study and look at in this unit as a AAA title played on a $4,000 high-end gaming machine. I'm not digital prejudiced either. I'm very into tabletop, board, pen and paper, and role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons, all really serious areas of inquiry in this unit. And what we're really concerned with are the different ways of experiencing games. How games design that experience, and this is talking about experiences more than just fun, but anguish, guilt, nervousness, panic, fear, terror, but fun and sociality and enjoyment and leisure. And what we're going to do, particularly with the third assignment, where you're going to be designing a concept for a serious game, is we're going to learn about how we might be able to use video games, right? How we might be able to use the complexity, the richness, and the appeal of games to advance other interests and agenda. But we're also going to encourage you in this unit to understand games culture as this really distinct entity, often very problematic at times, but worth understanding as a really kind of dominant and prevalent cultural force. When I got my PhD in game studies, I walked up onto the stage at the University of Melbourne, and they read out, when you get a PhD, they read out the topic of your PhD. And the Chancellor at the University of Melbourne shakes my hand. He says, "Oh, sounds a lot like fun." And it is, but it's also very serious business. As my book title might lead you to believe, internet spaceships are very serious business. Because play is a central aspect of human culture, society, communication, and it's occupied the work of scholars much longer than video games. Gameplay and video game play is part of a very long history of human and animal activities. Fun is still important, and it's why it's so important, but studying games is a serious thing. Gregory Bateson wrote in 1955 about animal play. And he looks at animals to show how play is so important. It's key to evolution and development of communication and meta-communication in both animals and children. In order to play, an animal and a child must be aware that its actions and those of its fellows are not real. Right? Having a conscious distinction between the nips and the bites of a fellow plaything is one of the earliest kind of ways in which we can understand animal consciousness to be developing. Right? This is a really integral part of what it means to be kind of conscious and what it means to be human. And scholars like Huizinga, Kaloa, Bernard Suits all write about the importance of non-digital gaming in culture since as far back as the 1930s. And these authors are some of the foundational scholars in the field of game studies. But despite play having been studied for quite a long time, a field of game studies, an academic discipline of game studies, only really emerged in the late 1990s, 30 years after the first video game, and decades after video game systems and arcade machines became increasingly popular and a dominant social force. Computer game scholar Espen Aarseth famously claimed in 2001 that 2001 was computer game studies year one. Fun fact, the first PhD on video games was written in the mid-1980s about Colossal Cave Adventure as a new form of kind of interactive fiction and what that might mean. So, to stay on this topic, why is that? It's because we do have levels of prejudice towards play, and particularly adult play. We think of play as a thing that is done by children and for children, which of course it is. But as we're going to explore in this lecture and in this module, we're going to see how much play is happening with adults on our phones, on our computers, and on our video game consoles, and how it's not just a child's thing, and should be something that is taken seriously as an area of academic study. The question of why people play at all has occupied scholars for some time, predating video games. And a lot of the time we focus on the types of experiences that we get, right? Roger Kaloa, who was one of the early theorists in game studies, talks about the drive for competition and the drive for role-playing and having perception-altering experiences. And for Nick Yee, who did a large-scale study of massively multiplayer online role-play game players, particularly World of Warcraft players, he argues that people play to create avatars, different identities, to form relationships, play together for growth and to change. He argues one of the reasons that they play is because they're addicted, another topic that we'll encounter later in the unit, for memorable experiences, but also to make a living. But these categories are often emergent out of the particular games that people are playing. But what we see is an enormous breadth of what constitutes a video game, particularly now, where the tools that we use to create video games have in some ways become democratized. They're much easier to access. You, on your own, could develop a video game that might sell 1 million copies and make you very, very wealthy. So we're seeing a much wider breadth of reasons to play, and the list, there would be an enormous number if we tried to list them all out. But what the Digital Australia report, which is a large-scale survey about video game consumption in Australian households, found that an enormous, well over half of the Australian population, we'll jump into the statistics later in the lecture, found that people play for, again, a wide variety of reasons, but the reasons that we play change as we grow older, right? For younger adults, it's about passing time and having fun, but for working adults, it's passing time isn't what we're doing. We're very, very busy. So it's about having fun and de-stressing. For older adults, other reasons emerge, such as keeping your mind active. So games offer us a real breadth of different experiences. One of the activities we're going to get you to do as you're trying to explore who you are as a gamer and the reasons that you play is you're going to do one of Nick Yee's player motivation survey to understand what type of gamer you are. So maybe some of you are at home thinking, oh no, I don't play games. I can't possibly do well in this unit. But you definitely can. There is no assumed knowledge required in this unit, and your ability to do well in this unit and with this assessment is about reading and engaging with the course material. You don't need to consider yourself a gamer to do well in this unit, and this is even a concept that we critically discuss next week. Normally when I do this in a real lecture theatre, as opposed to my home office, I'll survey the room and ask, well, who here really plays games more than once per week? And invariably, about a half to 2/3 of the unit really don't consider themselves players, and a third really don't play games at all, but everybody has a great time. That's because studying games is a lot of fun. You might be a lot more familiar with games than you think, though. Gaming isn't just about these high-end $1,000 machines and playing AAA titles, but playing mobile games on your phone is just as legitimate. And I'm yet to find anyone who doesn't have at least one game in their, hasn't at least played at least one game in their history. And I would note that not playing at all is a sure sign clinically that you're a sociopath. So I hope that you are all playing at home and you can play this week with impunity. Your lecturer told you to. This shift towards mobile gaming is part of a larger shift towards the casualization of video games, a concept that we're going to also discuss next week. But it's one of the required readings for this week to kind of understand where gaming is at culturally. Playing games isn't just for people who kind of devote their identity to gaming, but for everybody. They're cheaper, they're temporally flexible, and they're easier to play. And we're also going to be talking about this next week when we're looking at casual games, and again in week 11 when we're looking at locative games. Games like Pokemon Go that interface with the physical world around you, creating an augmented reality-like experience. So let's go into some of these reasons for studying games in a little bit more detail. Games are important. They're the cultural medium of the 21st century in the way that film was the cultural medium of the 20th and literature was the cultural medium of the 19th century. 67% of Australians play games, and I'm not just talking about teenage males playing Call of Duty. 46% of people who play games in Australia are women, 77% of players are over 18, 43% of those players are over 65 years old. 68% of kids aged 9 to 12 in Australia have played Minecraft. That's just one game, and an average daily gameplay session is 89 minutes, rivaling what we see in film. And it's worth checking out the recommended reading, which is the latest Digital Australia report, which has some of these numbers in more specific detail. Maybe you can try and find a similar survey from the country that you're in and share that in the discussion groups this week. Another reason for studying games is because they are economically important. The global games industry is worth an estimated $150 billion, right? We're seeing 7 to 10% year-on-year growth in this market. A huge portion of that, 68.2 billion, is in mobile gaming. And in Australia, this market is worth over $1 billion. Just one video game, Untitled Goose Game, honked its way to 1 million sales this year, developed by a core team of 4 developers in Melbourne, meaning that this one video game likely made more than all Australian films in the film industry. Well, this year isn't a great year for the film industry, but it's made an enormous amount of money, surpassing that of the Australian-made, Australian-storied film industry. Of course, I'm not counting there movies like Spider-Man, which are filmed in Spider-Man, or Thor movies, which are filmed in Queensland. Now, games are increasingly a field of work. Game-related practices have become a central part of what we refer to as the digital economy. I'm referring here to esports and pro gaming. The Dota 2 video game esport tournaments had a $25 million, the International had a $25 million prize pool. Fortnite tournaments have $100 million prize pools. Video game streamers on sites like Twitch.tv make hundreds of thousands of dollars a month streaming their play of digital games to huge audiences of thousands of players. Seeing this on sites like Twitch, Douyu, but also YouTube and other influencer platforms. And so increasingly we're seeing video games as this, not just this thing that we spend money on, but a site of economic production. But another reason beyond the kind of number of people who are playing and the amount of money people are spending in video games is that we should study games because games reflect our society. All art forms that we create reflect the society that produces them, right? The paintings of the Renaissance reflect a certain aspiration about what the world might be, a fascination with science, but also a deep religious spirit. And so too do video games that are being produced now. And you really start to see marked differences between the video games of the 90s, the early 2000s, and the video games of today. They reveal our values and our taboos, the cultural logics, the configurations of power in society, our grand narratives, prejudices, and misconceptions, and what we desire in the world. And what we're going to really explore in week 10 is the ways that video games can be used to purposefully play with and against society. I'm talking here specifically about Tom Nook, the banker in Animal Crossing, who encourages us to take out more and more mortgages, perhaps a metaphor for the US banking system. And we recommend some specific examples for you to play at home that are really good examples of how games can be a form of critique and can really speak to aspects of society. I spoke about some in the lecture last week, Amazon Race and TurboFlex. Papers, Please is one of the ones that we recommend. This is a great review from a video game called Civilization 4. This is the person saying that unions in the game are poorly designed because they only give a positive effect. They don't give a negative effect. And it's because this reviewer, erroneously I would add, believes that unions are a bad thing and thinks that the game should reflect their political understanding of the world. Right? It's because games are all representations, an idea we'll talk a lot more in week 10. But another reason that we should study games is to be able to critically examine them. And this is something that I find a lot of people, particularly people who play a lot of video games at home, find quite difficult. I want you to bring the critical attitude that you would bring to reading a film, that you would bring to an academic reading, or to studying a book, a literature, because your experience is a lot more in-depth and complex than that was fun, right? Why was it fun? What made it fun? What does this tell you about the creator? What does it tell you about you? What types of experiences do other people have? Because when we can better critically examine games, we can better participate in the debates, the political, the legal, the cultural debates that surround them. It is one of the most culturally significant media forms, particularly for younger generations. But we often find people are unequipped to talk about some of the critical issues in kind of games media and in games design. I'm referring here to the Grand Theft Auto 5 torture scene. Is it satire? Is it sadism? And I can't recall her name in Metal Gear Solid 5, who, due to her injuries, has to wear as little clothes as possible because otherwise covering up her skin would suffocate her. Video games. So being able to kind of better critically examine some of these ideas and some of these claims allows us to kind of advance that critical cultural debate around video games as an emerging media. And in doing so, we can get to the point where we can study better games, right? If we want to make better games, we have to have a really decent literacy about them. And a critical literacy is best because it allows us to make games that push the boundaries of what a game is, surprise you with new experiences, entice more people to play, and maybe let you say more and newer things about video games. Some great examples for me are Really Bad Chess. This is a mobile game which has asymmetric chess pieces, so each player doesn't have the same pieces. Really, I played quite a bit of chess when I was a lot younger, but got quite bored with it. But the Really Bad Chess just makes it this whole new crazy experience. We can think about games like Catnips, a game where you use the controller, which is the nipples of a cat toy, to direct milk towards kittens, to start to really think about what interfaces of games do and become for our gameplay experience. Or more seriously, games like That Dragon Cancer, which explores the experience of having a young child diagnosed with a terminal illness. Games can be sites for an enormous number of experiences, far beyond the graphically realistic killing that we see in games like Call of Duty. But, and I promise you this, we study games because it allows us to enjoy them more. If you can critically understand your experience, you can add a new layer to your experience of them. It will I want to open you up to new kinds of games and new kinds of play. Those of you who don't play, I really want you to start playing, and those of you who already play, I want you to expand the types of games that you play. Hopefully this unit will introduce you to these new ways of playing and new ways of enjoying games. As a field, depending on where you're doing this unit from, we're going to draw on a really wide variety of approaches because we're a new discipline. And so we don't have this canonical way of thinking about things, but we have a lot of academics coming into games from a wide variety of areas, which actually gives us a lot of really interesting different perspectives, because someone who's coming to games from film or literature studies is of course going to have a different perspective from someone who's looking at games from the perspective of design computing, psychology, or anthropology. And there's a real wide variety of topics that we might possibly cover. Now I'm going to just for a moment talk about what someone might say is a bit of a silly question, but I know that at least one of you is out there thinking this. What are games? For those of you who really have never really played digital games and never really engaged with the culture around it, I recommend taking a look at these two Wikipedia pages and a different chapter in the Proteus Paradox book about the kind of origins of digital games. We're mostly going to be focusing on digital games and devices, but that doesn't mean that your experiences playing non-digital games are not legitimate. Another question is how to play games. If you've never played them, this is going to be something that's quite difficult for you. And it's one of the barriers that really keeps a lot of people out of gaming. So there's four main kind of online stores where you can download games for your PC or your Mac. There's Steam, Humble Store or Humble Bundle, itch.io, and the Epic Games Store. On Steam, if the game doesn't work on your computer, you can get a refund if you've played for less than 2 hours. Talk to your tutor if you give this a go and are having any trouble. Something really cool at the moment is that the Epic Games Store gives out a free game every 2 weeks, and they've had some real crackers, because normally what they do is they go kind of back a few years to pull up games that obviously aren't selling so well now because they're a few years old, and they make that really like critically acclaimed game available for free. Cool, so I'm going to break here and then we're going to jump to the next shorter video, which is going to be more of a course overview. Thanks very much. Okay, welcome back. So we are here in part 2, which is a bit of a short course overview, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the assessment. So next week we're going to be looking at game cultures, and you're going to be understanding the way in which representation and identity impact people's engagement and experience with media. You're also going to understand and be able to usefully apply the concept of hegemonic masculinities to how play and non-play practices are gendered in everyday life. The key reading here is a classic piece by Adrian Shaw on Do You Identify as a Gamer that kind of really examines and unpacks this concept of the gamer identity and what that's meant for game culture. The following week, we're going to be looking at serious games, and this is introducing the concept of procedural rhetoric, which is an extremely important concept for assignment 3. It's a tough reading, but it's really worthwhile, and it's going to be really useful for being able to articulate while the game that you're pitching for assignment 3 is serious, and how you've embedded learning not just in kind of content that's broken up into the game, but into the play of the game itself. We've recommended some serious games for you to play at home: This War of Mine, Papers, Please, Unmanned, and That Dragon Cancer. And so these are games that you can play before class and then bring to the class discussion. But we're also going to be playing some serious games in class in the groups that you'll be doing your assignment in. Week after that, we're going to be looking at mobile games, particularly looking on the way that they mediate and remediate spatial relationships in offline and online spaces. As a large group, we're going to discuss the readings to understand what Adrien de Souza understands by playful space, and how the historical concept of the flaneur can be a useful way to understand the transformative potential of location-based gaming. In your groups, you're going to be developing a pitch on a location-aware mobile game, just to kind of get feedback on what it means to come up with a concept for a video game. We've also recommended some mobile games that are really exemplary examples of what mobile games can be if you're not really into that. So again, required readings, required gamings. In the last week, we're going to be looking at designing games. So I'm going to be trying to equip you with the skills and the way to articulate what a game's design is and how to design it. Because in the final assignment, you're going to be tasked with developing a concept for serious games in groups of 3. In this week's lecture and tutorial, that is in week 12, we're going to be discussing how these games are designed and how to talk about games design, and how games can be something that you can be persuasive with, and how you can do things with video games. All right, in the tutorials this week, you're going to be pitching your initial ideas about your concept for some class feedback and critical discussion. So that's great. Thanks very much for watching this very short extra part, and we will see you next week where we're going to be talking about video game culture. Thanks very much.